Okay, we're going to get started with our next session. I don't think I introduced myself to the NAU students. I'm Professor Tim Langell. I'm an associate teaching professor here in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and director of or chair of the board of directors this year for Genocide Awareness Week. And I'm honored to be introducing a friend, mentor, and outstanding scholar, Professor Alex Alvarez, who I imagine the NAU folks know well. And it's great to, again, have you all here. I love that enthusiasm in the back. You're a good hype man. I love it. So Professor Alvarez around NAU might also be known as the homecoming why can't I say this word? I'm just going to call you homecoming queen, dedicatee. But, you know, he was honored and deservedly so this year. So I'll go into the bio before giving the stage here to the man, the myth, and the legend. So Alex Alvarez is a professor and co-chair in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northern Arizona University. His books include Government, Citizens, and Genocide, Genocidal Crimes, Native America and the Questions of Genocide, Unstable Ground, Climate Change, Conflict, and Genocide. Very apt, important, timely topic right now. And what he'll be discussing today, the book Lethal Elites, the Institutions, Professionals That Made the Holocaust Possible. He's the editor for Genocide Studies International. He's the vice chair of the Academic Advisory Board and course director of the Genocide and Human Rights University program at the Zoryan Institute. And we do have some Zoryan Institute representation here. So you really got a home crowd here. This is like your second home. Alex is also, board member here with Genocide Awareness and runs absolutely a fantastic course for the Zoryan Institute in Toronto. Got to witness that this summer, and you really do an exemplary job. But I've hyped you enough. And I got to put in the plug too with the hype. 20% off on the book for people interested. So we got bargains. You didn't come down to Phoenix for no good reason. We're gonna feed you. We got book deals, and happy to have you here.
Thank you for that introduction, Tim. I appreciate it a lot. Good morning, everyone. How are you? It's wonderful to see you here today and have such a full room. Thanks to everyone who's come down the mountain from NAU to participate in today's events. I do want to warn those of you who are on the bus, however, that there will be a search as you go on so that you do not bring ASU swag up in the meeting. Okay, just saying. Anyway, you can bring that. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for being here. This means a lot. We've spent a lot of time organizing the events of this week on a topic that I'm guessing all of us can agree on is very timely and important in today's world. And what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time talking with you today about the latest book that I've co-authored with my friend and colleague, Richard Fernandez. So let me start with the 15th of September, 1947. On that day, a trial began in Nuremberg, Germany, sometimes referred to as the most German of all German cities. This historic city was once host to the Nazi Party rallies in which thousands marched and paid homage to German fascism, and had now become the seat of post-war justice. This trial was the 9th of 12 trials to take place in front of US military tribunals after the end of the Second World War. Now, most people are familiar with the famous first trial in which leading Nazi defendants were made to answer for the crimes of the regime. Some of you may have seen the more recent film, I think it's called Nuremberg with Russell Crowe, that kind of gives you a sense of what that was like. But less well known is that there were a fair number of subsequent military tribunals that followed. And in this particular trial, the 9th, a panel of 3 judges sat in review of the United States of America versus Otto Ollendorf et al., a case that has sometimes been referred to as the largest murder trial in history. On trial were 24 officers with command responsibility in the Einsatzgruppen, or special task forces, of Nazi Germany. As many of you probably know, in the wake of the June 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, the German advance eastward into Soviet territory was shadowed by 4 specially created special task force units, Einsatzgruppen, composed of about 3,000 men drawn largely from the SS Security Service, the security police, as well as members of the secret police, the infamous Gestapo. By and large, they weren't trained military personnel. They were more akin to a paramilitary kind of force. They had as their primary responsibility certain executive measures or special tasks. These euphemisms actually concealed a very deadly purpose. They were mobile death squads, whose main job was to seek out and execute any sources of resistance in the newly conquered territories. This included Soviet officials, as well as Jewish men. It was soon expanded to include Jewish women and children, and eventually it would become the primary focus of these killing units. And in countless actions throughout the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, these units went from community to community, rounding up Soviet officials and Jews, who were then usually transported to isolated areas and murdered. All told, these special task forces were responsible for the deaths of more than 2 million men, women, and children. Most of them were Jews. This is sometimes referred to as the Holocaust by bullets. This first phase was responsible for the deaths of approximately 40% of all the Jews killed during the entire Holocaust. And it was for these horrific crimes that the 24 officers had been brought to the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg to stand trial on 3 specific counts: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in a criminal organization, the SS. So who were the men who led these units? And hopefully, as I progress, you'll see how this connects to the theme of this book. The lead defendant, Otto Ollendorf, this is a picture of the task forces. Otto Ollendorf was a colonel in the SS and in overall command of Einsatzgruppen D, whose area of operations encompassed southern Ukraine, the Crimea, and the Caucasus. During his pre-trial interviews, he calmly and dispassionately related the details of the mass shootings to his American interrogators without once expressing emotion or remorse. Major Leon Goldensohn, a psychologist who interviewed him, concluded that to perpetrate his horrific crimes, he could only have been, quote, a sadist, a pervert, or a lunatic. Goldensohn simply couldn't understand how a normal person could command such a unit and therefore labeled Ollendorf a monster. After interviewing Alfred Filbert, there we go, the first leader of Einsatzkommando 9 of Einsatzgruppe B, a British psychologist concluded, at no time did I feel that I was conversing with an educated or cultivated person, despite Filbert having a doctorate in law. He went on to describe Filbert as having never been other than a limited lower middle class status and promotion seeking Philistine with a good boy underling mentality. His cold, inhuman eyes that wept only for himself were an accurate pointer to his psychological makeup. These kinds of reductive interpretations were very common and reflected a widely held belief that people who commit such heinous crimes like genocide must somehow be deranged. One historian characterized the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen as cranks, living bankrupt lives, and the dregs of German society. And given the nature of the crimes, it's easy to understand coming to such a conclusion. But here's what's uncomfortable. The evidence suggests otherwise. Both Ohlendorf and Filbert were highly educated men. Otto Ohlendorf studied economics and law at several very prestigious universities, and he received a doctorate in jurisprudence. This academic background doesn't fit necessarily with the image we have of someone who leads death squads. Many other leaders of the Einsatzgruppen were similarly well educated. Between 1941 and 1943, 15 men commanded the Einsatzgruppen, and of these, at least 6 had earned their doctorates. Of the 69 men who commanded smaller detachments from those Einsatzgruppen, known as Einsatzkommandos, 16 had PhDs. And almost all of the others had attended university. Commenting on this reality, the presiding judge of the tribunal wrote, "Since the 24 defendants were charged with 1 million murders, one would expect to see in the dock a band of coarse, untutored barbarians. Instead, one beheld a group of men with a formidable educational background." This trial, the United States of America versus Otto Ohlendorf et al., I think powerfully illustrates that highly educated and influential societal elites played important roles in facilitating and carrying out the Holocaust, which is the focus of our book. The leaders of the Einsatzgruppen were also not exceptional in this regard. Some 41% of the security service of the Nazi regime had higher education at a time when the national average was around 2 to 3%. In his analysis of the biographies of more than 1,500 perpetrators, the sociologist Michael Mann found that medical and legal professionals were overrepresented among those who carried out the Holocaust. Think about that just for a moment. Highly educated and trained doctors and lawyers were overrepresented among the ranks of the perpetrators of genocide. Law degrees, and especially medical degrees, are not easily earned distinctions, and they require a high degree of intelligence, education, and training. Yet these learned members of society, these highly educated members of society, were disproportionately represented among those who played key leadership roles in visioning, justifying, planning, organizing, and carrying out the mass murder of millions. In this sense, they were not just ordinary perpetrators. Instead, we must understand they were rather exceptional in terms of their education, their training, and their influence. Further evidence of educated, high-status elites responsible for the Holocaust is found in the Wannsee Conference, convened in a lakeside mansion just outside of Berlin in January 1942, in which a number of senior-level representatives of various branches of the Nazi government met over good food and cognac and wine and cigars to coordinate the policies of the different agencies and to organize the processes of extermination. At that time, the war is in process, and you have different branches of the government doing different kind of things and wanting different solutions to what they refer to as the Jewish problem. And the goal of this conference was to coordinate, and it is here that they truly began the process of coordinating what we now refer to as the Holocaust. At the time of the conference, approximately 80% of the eventual victims were still alive. 16 months later, in the fall of 1943, 80% had been killed. Of the invited participants, 2/3 possessed university degrees, while more than half had doctorates. These are just two examples, but they illustrate in what I think are important ways and contradict the widespread arguments that the Holocaust, and I will argue by implication other examples of genocide, are carried out by the ignorant and the uneducated. We have to acknowledge that the crimes of the Nazis were not the product of, quote unquote, an ill-defined mob, and Nazism did not represent, quote unquote, the triumph of socially declassed thugs, psychopathic sadists, and marginal brutes from outside the mainstream of civilized German society. The Nazis were not simply thugs and beer hall agitators. Far from it. The reality is the Holocaust was the product of choices made by thousands of individuals from many walks of life who contributed in a myriad of ways. These include the ordinary rank and file perpetrators that have been the subject of a great deal of scholarship and attention over the years. But they also include highly educated individuals from the middle and upper classes who use their expertise, their training, their skill, their influence, their authority to marginalize, to persecute, and ultimately murder millions of men, women, children, and infants. This is the reality. Rank and file perpetrators were largely organized and set in motion by these highly educated professionals who not only participated in the persecution and victimization of different groups, but who were instrumental and key in conceiving and organizing, influencing, justifying, persuading, so forth and so on, the policies and practices of persecution and extermination. And this is, I think, for many people, a difficult reality to accept. It's easier to believe that violence, especially extreme forms of it, are only carried out by deviants. Educated people, in contrast, are perceived as being above such behavior. This kind of perspective is reflected in the words of, anyone who know who Edward James Olmos, the actor, is? Okay. And who once asserted, education is the vaccine for violence. Similarly, a former governor of Florida once stated, knowledge is the antidote to the poison of prejudice. Now, let me make a statement here for especially the students. My argument here is not that education doesn't matter. That's not what I'm getting at. But rather, what is important is the kind of education you receive, and we'll get there. But I don't want you to leave it, well, yeah, Professor Alvarez said education really doesn't matter, so why bother? Okay. Violence, in other words, is not the province of just the uneducated or the uncivilized. And in fact, there are many scholars who've argued that modernity and modern civilization itself carries within it the seeds of genocidal violence. So the focus of this book demonstrates, I believe, that educated professionals can and do play critical roles in the production of even the most extreme forms of destructive and violent behavior, including genocide. And our focus is on exploring the various ways in which powerful and influential elites use their status and education and all of the training and expertise and wealth and influence they possess to support the Nazi regime and to organize, plan, and then implement the Holocaust. And in so doing, did much to provide a sense of legitimacy to the wider society of the persecutory policies of National Socialism. They were truly lethal elites. So what do we mean by elites? What is this term? We use the term, Rich and I, in its sociological meaning, in which they comprise those who enjoy a disproportionate share of power and authority within a society. This is why they're sometimes referred to as power holders. And in our book, we've organized it according to broad social institutions and professional categories, in which our book examines the specific roles that elites played in supporting and making possible the persecution and extermination of the victims of Nazism. We have to understand, in the modern world, there are a variety of occupations and professions that have a high amount of status and prestige, and oftentimes, because of that, have a lot of influence and power. These tend to be occupations that require higher education, technical training often. They are competitive, and because of that, have a lot of social, political, economic, and moral authority and power. And that last sentence, think about, because what I'm trying to suggest here, we have to understand power comes in many forms. It's not just one thing. In many ways, this book is about power. But we need to remember that power can take many different forms and is manifested and then applied or exercised in multiple ways. So the first and most obvious form tends to be coercive power, physical violence, if you will. This refers to the ability to threaten or employ force, and in Germany, as in most modern states, this was largely the domain of law enforcement, and the military. In the early years of the Nazi movement, they relied heavily on the violence of the paramilitary wing of the movement, the brown shirts of the SA. But once in power and seeking to increase their legitimacy, the Nazis increasingly resorted to more legally and socially accepted forms of coercive power. So in chapter 2, we examine the ways in which lawyers and judges used the law as a tool to dismantle democracy in Germany. It's important for us to understand, most democracies do not fall from outside forces. They fall from within, where democratic processes are used to undermine the democracy itself. And that was certainly the case of what happened with Weimar Germany as it transitioned into Nazi Germany. And an important piece of that was using the law as a weapon. The Nazis passed many, many laws that not only dismantled civil rights and protections, and by the way, Weimar Germany had one of the most progressive constitutions in the day, that one that would even today be seen as being very much appropriate and apt in these times. But various emergency degrees, various kind of legal states of exception were used to undermine and ultimately to abolish constitutional rights, civil protections, and so forth. We have to remember, as the criminologist Austin Turk once wrote, law is a resource that different people use to compete for their own interests and so forth. That law is not just some impersonal and neutral force. It is something that can be weaponized, and that's certainly what we see here. And not only does the profession of law itself carry tremendous prestige and status, written laws are a powerful vehicle to cloak policies of persecution within a mantle of legitimacy. There's a lot of criminological research that reveals that we often use laws as kind of a shorthand for helping us understand what is right and what is wrong. If something's legal, it's right. If something's wrong, it's not right. Now, I'm simplifying, and there's a lot of complexity there, but you get my general drift. And so the Nazis worked to transform the German legal system from a mechanism of justice into a tool of repression. And this was especially the case for, and this is not for those of you who are a little older, not the People's Court of TV, but the People's Court, the Volksgericht, which was a special court established by the Nazis that was run by this man, Roland Freisler. And their job was to protect the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft, from all enemies, including and especially domestic ones. Now, here's what's interesting. This court, rather than being guided by existing constitutional law and the well-known legal principle of nullum crimen sine lege, which means no crime without law, the People's Court discarded traditional legal guidelines in favor of making decisions based on the feeling or conscience of the people's community. If that sounds kind of vague and subjective, exactly. They also interpreted things based on their understanding of the will of the Führer. In other words, what Adolf Hitler wanted, their job was to incorporate into their legal rulings. The Führer principle was summarized in a memo, and it consisted of 3 points. Law must serve the political leadership. The Führer is the supreme judge. And a judge who is in a direct relation of fealty to the Führer must judge like the Führer. And so it meant that this court was not constrained by legal precedent or statute, concern for individual rights and protections, or even facts themselves. Law and justice became arbitrary. And in fact, over the course of the regime, this court was responsible for, if any of you ever heard of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose, this was the court that heard them and executed these young people, death by guillotine. This is the court that also, increasingly towards the end of the war, if people made a joke about the war or a critical comment about the Nazi Party or so forth, they were liable to end up in front of this court and received, in many cases, death sentences. All right. In Chapter 3, All in a Day's Work, we extend the discussion of coercive power into review of the ways in which the German army came to support the Nazis. For the longest time, it was believed that the German Wehrmacht, the army, was innocent of the crimes of the Nazis. And there were different reasons for this and so forth. But over time, we've come to learn that actually the army and the special action squads and the regime operated hand in glove. There are many examples of those shooting actions where military soldiers would volunteer to participate, or at the very least would come to take pictures and bystand and watch the execution of these innocent civilians. Now, power is also linked with wealth. When Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933, the Nazi Party was largely bankrupt. And one of the first things he set up was a meeting with industrialists, such as this individual, where essentially they were convinced to contribute vast amounts of funds and support to the Nazi Party, which they did. But they benefited from it. The title of this chapter is called Howling with the Wolves, because later in trial, this individual, he said, well, we knew in the business world then that every now and again you have to learn how to howl with the wolves if you want to be successful. One had to talk the language of the Nazi Party and howl with the wolves, is what he said. Many industrialists and business leaders, although initially hesitant about the Nazis, realized that accommodation with the government could be highly profitable. And we see this in terms of big industrial concerns that essentially ended up using a lot of slave labor from various camps for their purposes, for their business enterprises. And in fact, conditions oftentimes were so bad that even the SS complained to those business leaders because they had a hard time replacing those who were literally worked or beaten to death. Subsequent to the end of the war, many of these business leaders were put on trial, and their argument was they didn't know what was going on and our conditions were humane, which is not very believable whatsoever. We can also see it in the work of an individual by the name of Kurt Prüfer. He was an engineer, small fry, working at a family-owned business called Topf & Sons. They mostly made beer brewing equipment. I mean, it's Germany, right? But he was responsible for building crematoria. Crematoria was not something widely used in Germany at that time. Most of the crematoria were for disposing of livestock and things like this. But close by to where his family business that he operated from, a new concentration camp was opened called Buchenwald. And in there, a lot of people were being killed or worked to death. And what the SS who ran the camp had to do was transfer the corpses to a nearby town in order for them to be disposed of. And so they put out a contract. They wanted a mobile crematoria, so we don't have to do that. He saw this as an opportunity. He barely had kept his job during the turbulent years of the Weimar era, the Great Depression, hyperinflation, and all of this. He had taken a significant pay cut, and his area was niche within this company. So he saw this as his opportunity. And so he put in a bid, he developed a crematoria, and because he was so willing to work with them to redo it, he ended up becoming very successful and important, and promotions within the firm, bonuses, and he ended up designing most of the crematoria that were used in places such as Auschwitz, a place where he often traveled to because these crematoria were exceeding the capacity they were designed for and cracking and having other kinds of problems. And he would go there and he would express frustration, not because of having to burn the corpses of those who had just been killed, but rather because his ovens were not producing the capacity that he wanted. His choices, it's pretty clear that his history, he was not a fervent Nazi. He was not someone who was a rabid anti-Semite. Rather, these were career choices for him. Amoral career choices. We can look at the role of the churches, and we did that. I think, for example, some of you may be familiar with von Galen. He's the one who famously gave the third of a series of sermons protesting the German euthanasia program. Some of you may know that the Nazis' first bout of mass killing was not the Holocaust, but was rather a program that was designed to improve the genetic health of the German people. And essentially it involved killing people with mental and physical handicaps. Initially just children, eventually including adults. Widespread outrage, often led by church leaders, brought an end to it. But such resistance, when it came time to fellow Jewish citizens, was not forthcoming. And we see the role of the churches in Nazi Germany, a lot of ambivalence back and forth. And in fact, I think that might be part of one of the panels a little later today, so I don't want to go into this too much. How are we doing time-wise? Okay, we got time. Is this making sense? Okay. In the modern era, the rise of science, we have to also understand, to pivot just a little bit, helped spark revolutions in industry, technology, medicine, and education among many sectors of society. Genocidal states often rely on those kinds of scientific ideas and practices to justify their policies of destruction. Because they're scientific, it provides a weight and an authority that would otherwise have been lacking. These issues are ones we explore in Chapter 6, Life Unworthy of Life, Lebensunwerts a term that was used for those with disabilities. Another term that was sometimes used to refer to them were useless eaters. If you could not contribute to the well-being of our society, you're useless and we don't need you. The Khmer Rouge once had a saying, something like, to keep you, to lose you or to kill you is no loss, to keep you is no benefit. And that kind of thinking is very similar to what we have here as well. Medical professionals were instrumental in this euthanasia program. Think about that. Doctors who take the Hippocratic Oath, whose job it is to heal and help and do no harm, were instrumental in conceiving and designing a practice whereby doctors would evaluate people, put a check by a name, and that young person would be transported to a killing center, often a hospital, where they experimented with different methods of mass murder. Many of those professionals were then later transferred to the East, where they became important in pioneering the methods that were used in some of the death camps of Reinhard, Treblinka, Sobibor, Kulmhof, and others. I know, heavy stuff. In chapter 7, getting the most out of the fatted calf. Oh, actually, one last thing I want to say, though, in terms of the medical professionals. We wonder about how could they justify this? And in their thinking, and this is really key, they were not interested in the health of an individual. They were interested in the health of the community. And so just as a doctor who combats cancer, and this is the language that was sometimes used, has to create, I don't know, different kind of procedures where you cut out the cancer to protect the organism as a whole, that was the mindset they adopted. They believed in eugenics and in social Darwinism. They didn't invent those ideas. In fact, many of them were borrowed from other countries, including Great Britain and the United States. Absolutely. And so they adopted them, but they took them to an extreme. Yeah. All right. In chapter 7, getting the most out of the fatted calf. And this was a phrase used by this individual. A lot of different scientists participated, but I think this case is really revealing, not just for certain mindsets, but also for how politics can do things that we might be really think is very questionable. So this is Wernher von Braun. He was a German engineer whose passion in life was the development of rockets. He joined the Nazi Party not because he was a believer, but because that's how you get government contracts. He was a utilitarian thinker. His calculations were, who would support my work? He didn't care much about Nazi ideology and their quest for a pure racial society. It was about opportunity and funding. And all through the 1930s, he and his research team conducted military-funded research culminating in Germany's V1 and V2 rocket program, in which thousands of these rockets were fired at England, resulting in great loss of life and damage to British cities, excuse me. In addition, the Nazi rocket program run by von Braun was heavily dependent on slave labor. Concentration camp inmates who lived, worked, and died in very inhumane conditions in camps such as Dora and Nordhausen, they built and assembled his rockets. Any real or suspected sabotage on the part of the inmates was met with torture and execution. So savage were the conditions in the camps that one inmate who had transferred to Dora from Auschwitz remarked, compared to Dora, Auschwitz was easy. That's saying something. For Wernher von Braun, the brutal conditions of the camps, the death toll, the morality of slave labor was irrelevant. So in 1945, in May, as the war's ending, he surrenders to the US. And he, along with 1,600 other German engineers and scientists, were secretly transported to the US. He spent the rest of his career working on America's ballistic missile systems and creating the rockets that propelled American astronauts into space and to the moon. Something that actually kind of is very relevant given what's just occurred over these last days with the Artemis. He became such an important figure at NASA that his bust still stands at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Houston. He was also inducted into the National Academy of Science and was the recipient of the National Medal of Science. All of these were showered on him by the United States, despite his past as a Nazi and the architect of rocket attacks on England, not to mention his use of concentration camp slave labor. To him, it never mattered who he was working for, as long as he got to build his rockets. He once even said, "I don't care if I'm working for Uncle Sam or Uncle Joe," referring to Joseph Stalin, as long as that uncle is rich.
Wow.
Okay, so finally, do I have anything after? Yeah. Our concluding chapter, we explore the importance and relevance of these observations for other examples of genocide where we see many of the same kinds of patterns. And I could spend a long time giving you similar kinds of anecdotes and stories from Rwanda, Bosnia, Cambodia, and other places as well. Now, the book we write is not comprehensive. We don't explore the Germany civil service, even though it was influential and powerful. Politicians and media elites, also, we don't necessarily spend a lot of time discussing them. It's just simply too vast for us to be able to have done that. But we picked some we thought were representative and important and highlight some really key ideas. So, what lessons can we draw from the book? We learned that highly educated and trained professionals are not immune to the prejudices and the intolerance that are necessary preconditions for genocide. The lesson, again, and I do want to emphasize this, is not that education isn't important. I wouldn't be an educator if I didn't believe it to be important. But rather, what is important is the kind of education you receive. Education and training, in other words, especially when divorced from moral or humane considerations, do not by themselves guarantee resistance to harmful values and beliefs. Prejudice and intolerance are deeply rooted and intertwined phenomenon, and they are very resilient. There are no easy lessons here, or simple ones. Simplistic understandings about the nature of genocide and how people and societies come to support these destructive policies will not prevent its reoccurrence. It is really sobering to examine in detail how this promising Weimar Republic failed to preserve its democratic ideals and eventually gave way to the destructive and hate-filled Nazi regime. And to know that no society is immune to the same kinds of prejudices, political movements that made the Holocaust possible. And I would also highlight the issues raised in this book are not limited to the past. There are insights of contemporary relevance here. Social elites play significant roles in many social, political, economic, and religious contexts, not as extreme, perhaps, as some of the examples we've looked at in this book, yet which can also be very harmful, antisocial, and destructive. And we, unfortunately, live in a world ripe with threats to human safety and security. The current era, as so many past ages have been, is one of violent conflict, mass atrocity, and genocide. And these are being perpetrated at a time when we're experiencing a global retreat from democracy and an increase in authoritarianism that is often built on exclusionary ideals of national identity and destructive ideologies. This trend dramatically increases the risks of intolerance, persecution, and it illustrates the fragility of the social and political order that many of us have for too long taken for granted. And so for me, perhaps there's no better way to end than with the words of a survivor, not of the Holocaust, but of the Soviet Gulag. And the survivor was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who in his memoir of his time in Stalin's camp wrote, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts inside us, it oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil." And within these words, I think lies a powerful warning, ones which we have explored in this book. But there's also a powerful message of hope. And this cautionary tale illustrates, I believe, the dangers of not heeding the warning and not nurturing that small bridgehead of good. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alvarez. So we have approximately about 12 minutes for Q&A, and also we'll have a break after this so we can have some conversation overflow to that. And very nicely done. And I think you, as you said, you set the table for the panel later today on institutional complicity, and having Jim Waller as our keynote, right? I know he won't be exactly speaking about this, but this sets the table nicely for some of the stuff we have upcoming, and very apt with the moment we're living in, right? With complicity.
Hey, so something that really just stuck in my mind with what you were saying was about basically how a lot of these people who were complicit and instrumental in the machinery of the Holocaust were, professionals, and in cases like, tied to academia. And it also makes me think of like, Unit 731, how the research they got was then used to publish, academic papers. And so I almost wonder, like, without getting too into specifics, just because, how things are now, like, it's a weird thing to ask, but like, do you think, 20 years later, or how might, different societies, including our own, look back and see the ways that our own institutions, including ones that, have been seen as relatively benign because of the fact, well, relatively benign by most for so long, like academic institutions, how do we ensure that they don't get, weaponized and used in order to institute things like you were talking about, whether here or elsewhere?
I wish there was an easy answer to that question. And that is, I think, at the heart. How do we better educate our society, individuals, communities to better resist some of these forces? There's no one answer. And we know that people contribute in many different ways for many different reasons. There is no one perpetrator, no one kind. I will argue that in the modern era, and there's a lot of institutional, I didn't touch upon this, we spent a lot of time talking about, even working within institutional structures help facilitate participation. There's routinization, compartmentalization, where we don't see the end result of what we do, and we can basically take small, discrete steps that don't clearly connect with the end result, but which are part of these larger processes. In the modern era, we live in and work within bureaucracies. And the idea of bureaucracy, if any of you are fans of Max Weber, he explored this in great detail, but they are efficient systems. And the reason is, in part, because they take the human element out, right? So that everyone is treated fairly. It doesn't matter who you are, who you know, but that you're treated according to impersonal processes. But that also comes with a real risk, because we're dealing with human beings. And when you lose that ability to empathize, to understand, to take into consideration human qualities and factors, we lose something important. Institutions and organizations are amoral. I'm not saying immoral, but morality is considered to be separate. Doctors, lawyers, and others, they are technically trained. And the human element is something that is not always emphasized in the work that they do. How do we bring that back in ways that allow us to function well, but which increases our resistance to the kind of forces and processes of intolerance and prejudice, that's what we have to figure out. Yeah, I'm not sure if that helps make sense, but this is the struggle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like you said, I don't know if there is an answer.
Yeah. Okay, you're up next. We'll do what we did last time. We passed the concept.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. One thing that really stood out to me was that a lot of some people that participated didn't necessarily feel strongly for the Nazi cause, but was just seeking an opportunity. Since we live in a society where individual success is highly emphasized, currently, how do we prevent similar things from happening and people participating based on opportunity rather than morals?
Yeah, another tough. I keep thinking about academia. So when the Nazis came to power, one of the things they did is they basically purged Jews from academia. They also, women were released because their place, according to the Nazi belief, was in the home, right? That kind of thing. And what we find is a lot of academics went along with it. You know why? Because jobs. They wanted better positions. And it offered them opportunities. And those of you who work within academia, you get what I'm highlighting here. It can be a pretty cutthroat kind of profession. Honestly, to me, a lot of it is all about how we as a society and communities, how we create character, integrity, values that give people the internal strength, if you will, to evaluate choices in their own life in ways that are true to these kind of more humane principles. I mean, and I'm guessing many of you have at times made choices not to do something because you knew it was wrong, even though you might have benefited from it. And of course, being the flawed humans we are, I'm guessing many of us have also made choices that we knew we shouldn't have, but we did it anyway, right? That kind of thing. But honestly, there's no one answer. Part of it is about creating institutions that are resilient and strong, that protect the rights of people, right? Those kind of things. But I think part of it is something deeper. It's about the kind of society and the cultures that we create and what we learn to value and how we prioritize, I guess, humanity over self-interest, these kind of things. Yeah.
Go for it.
Thank you for being here. So we just had that quick conversation about people who might have other motivations to run with the party line, but there were also a lot of people who were like legitimate believers. Now I'm gonna like simplify this a ton, but a lot of you can very easily classify the Nazi ideology as like entirely like internally inconsistent and incoherent. So when you have these highly educated, potentially with, I'm going to say like lowercase L liberal arts backgrounds and whatnot, having this connection with an ideology that's so clearly incoherent, like where do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, incoherent ideologies. We are not rational. I used to think we were largely rational. For those who are a little older, maybe, we were like Spock, more logical than emotional. The reality is just the reverse. We're mostly emotional, and we have a thin veneer of rationality that helps us justify the emotional choices we make. And so we are very good at living with internal inconsistencies, cognitive dissonance, for those of you who might be familiar with that term. We're very good at that kind of thing. And the other thing I would also suggest is that it's easy sometimes to focus on one aspect of an ideology or of a movement that you agree with and maybe not really focus on ones that are more inconsistent. There were true believers, absolutely. I mean, people who sacrificed everything in cause, or when the regime was falling, thought it better to kill themselves and their children rather than live in a world without National Socialism. These are true believers. But we also have to understand there are many others who adapted themselves to the reality of the time. If your government, if your neighbors, if family is telling you certain things, it's a lot easier then to come and adopt those kind of perspectives than to be that lone voice, that lone individual who can resist it. So even with this notion that there are people who believe in whether it was Nazism or maybe some other kind of ideological system, there's even a lot of nuance within that, right? We all are very adaptable. That is one of the strengths of our species. We can adjust to almost everything. But that sometimes does not serve us well, because something that initially you might think was atrocious and horrible and you would never be part of that group or that movement, with enough social pressure or circumstances or benefits from coming to accept that, you can adapt, you can adjust. Yeah, it's dealing with human beings, it's complicated. It's never simple. Yeah.
There's one last. We only have time for one more question, and that's what I mean at the break. You have.
But I'm here if anyone wants to come up and chat.
This is your professor here. You can talk to all the time. Yes.
I think it's interesting what you said about how, like, everyday, quote unquote, civilized German society is what was largely responsible for some of the atrocities and just like the widespread apathy towards things like the Holocaust. I think of, like, in our own lives, like, I don't know, like, if like my clothes, my technology were like made in slave labor conditions, made in like things that would be considered mass atrocities. Do you see a connection between like civilized German society in like the 40s and 30s and like how we approach like goods today, is how we what we consider like normal, what we consider civilized?
Great point. A great point. I think absolutely. I'll copyright this, but you're welcome to use it. You can't have clean hands in a dirty world. In some ways, the lives we live, we are complicit in the suffering of others. Every day, we see other people who struggle or suffer, and we find it convenient to turn a blind eye, perhaps, or not focus our attention on that because it's just too hard, right? There are parallels. We are human beings. The Germans were human beings. We use the same kinds of mechanisms as a species to resolve some of these kinds of things. Were there Germans who knew what was going on, but busied themselves with their regular lives, getting the kids up and getting them ready to go to school or doing their job and not wanting to focus too much on these uncomfortable truths or realities? Absolutely. Are there similarities with the lives all of us lead or others lead in their daily lives? Absolutely. And that's where the challenge is. You know, how can we survive and cope and have the strength to get up in the morning and do our jobs, but at the same time understanding that we live in a world that has systems and structures that benefit from the exploitation or suffering of others. You cannot have clean hands in a dirty world. And so maybe what we can do is work to make as conscious choices as possible and to try in our little ways, make the world just a little bit better.
I think that's a fantastic way to end. So, I love it, the questions and all the extra questions we have in the room that we can carry over, because we're going to take a break. And again, your illustrious professor here and homecoming dedicatee. And well, you call yourself what you want. And that's, so we are going to take a break, and then we're going to have the student panel in about 15 minutes. And then after that, we're going to have lunch. But I also want to put in a plug, especially for the online audience. If this topic was interesting to you, we have Steve Remy and Megan Riley speaking on institutional complicity this afternoon. And our keynote tomorrow, James Waller at 4:30 p.m. in this room on Wednesday. He's going to be speaking about deeply divided societies, but he's worked a lot on perpetrators and how genocide is like most art foaming in the mouth ideologues, but it's how a society turns that makes it very dangerous. And institutions are a big
Right.
part of that.
And even if you are not here and can zoom in,
yeah,
Jim Waller's one of those scholars I have immense respect for.
Yeah.
And he's a really good presenter.
great speaker, and like a lot of like your work and his work here align really
Yeah.
well. So, and these are very important questions as everyone is picking up. So I'm going to shut up now, and you're going to go caffeinate, refresh, stretch your legs, and we'll come back for the student panel, which will be followed by lunch. We got tables out on the patio space there and next door as well. So take your break and enjoy it.